what are we supposed to achieve as a civilization? A very sensible goal for us to go after is for humanity to become a net positive to nature. If you were to flip it around, really any scenario where we do not achieve that, we eventually collapse civilization.
Today we're with Tom Chi. He's an inventor, a leader, a coach, a speaker, and an investor. I'm so happy to have you here on Emergent Leadership at SOSV. You are a good friend of ours, and you're doing some very interesting things in your life, including investing in biotech. I'm looking here on your website. It says you're helping humanity become a net positive to nature. What does that mean, and how do we go about doing that?
So I think a lot of hand-wringing has gone into, we have a linear extractive model to the economy, and we need to get to a circular model, a regenerative model, et cetera, et cetera. And I think all of that is fantastic. Like, that's definitely part of the work, but there's a bigger question of, for the sake of what? Like, why do any of this stuff? Is it really just, so your company has a marketing bullet that they can put on their website? Is it because you guys care about something more deeply? And if it is because you care about something more deeply, exactly what is that thing? So when you go and step away from the tactics of this technique or that technique, or this organizational structure, that organizational structure, do I do a B Corp? Do I do a regular C Corp? And then, just put things in our bylaws or governance. When you step away from all the day-to-day tactics of things like that, you just ask the larger question of, like, what are we supposed to achieve as a civilization? And the thing that I kind of put out there was, well, a very sensible goal for us to go after is for humanity to become a net positive to nature. Because if you were to flip it around, really any scenario where we do not achieve that, we eventually, we eventually collapse civilization. So, and that sounds really, really harsh, and I'm not really trying to frighten people instantly with it. But imagine, the net effect of your economy was to be just a little bit damaging to nature. Let's say 0.1% damaging to nature cumulatively per year. It means that in less than 1,000 years, you're going to have a collapse of civilization. It's kind of that simple. And right now, we're not like 0.1% negative to nature. We're significantly more in a lot of ways that are relatively straightforward to measure. And I define nature not in this kind of abstract spiritual way, though there is a abstract spiritual way to go relate to the concept. Practically speaking, it is air, water, soil, biodiversity. And in air, I include things like balancing atmospheric gases, way too many greenhouse gases. In water, I include healthy hydrological cycles and not just water pollution. Soil is relatively self-explanatory in terms of when it's getting healthier, when it's getting less healthy. And biodiversity is also pretty self-explanatory in terms of when it's getting healthier or not. And if we can arrive at a world where every year that humans are on the planet, because we're on the planet, the air is cleaner, the water is cleaner, we're building topsoil, and biodiversity is preserved or encouraged, then we can be on this planet for a very, very long period of time. I think there is well, this goes into lots of other conversations, but like another inspiring narrative, which is kind of taking over the world right now, is, oh, we're going to become a multiplanetary species. We're going to go to Mars. But I think, like, there is a hopeful way to look at that, and there's a cynical way to look at it. The hopeful way is, oh, we're expanding the frontiers. More of, whatever makes us human is going to get out into the ether and expand across the solar system, and maybe someday the galaxy. And cool. But then the cynical way to go look at that is, well, we made a mess of this planet, so let's move to another planet. And what I would like, I'm not here to go say, let's not go expand into the stars. My first job was as an astrophysicist. I literally love that type of work. And also, I don't think we should be out there settling a bunch of other planets until we become the sort of species that is good at treating planets. And we are real bad at treating planets, the one that we came up on. And look, when we become the sort of civilization that can be a net positive to whatever environment we enter, then great, go to as many planets as you want to at that point. And I don't think it's a thing where it's like, stop all the engines, we won't be able to go and work on this until we solve the bigger project of becoming net positive to nature. I think we get most of it done within the next 50 years, long before we have any significant settlements. But it's going to go and happen because we really, really focus on it happening. As much as we might do a moon shot or a Mars shot, we need to focus on it with that level of clarity, intensity of resources, and actually way more inclusively than this, the kind of Mars race has been going.
So, who are all the stakeholders, in your opinion, who need to be involved in these next 50 years?
So humanity broadly, so not just the richest folks in humanity. And there's this interesting book for sure, called the History of the World in Seven Cheap Things. And one of the things that they point to is the way that there is always, in every large civilization that we've created so far, there is always a lower class which is doing an outsized proportion of the labor. And to the extent that we continue to operate in that mold, I don't think we're ever going to be free. But we're in this interesting juncture where robotics, machine learning, advanced algorithms actually might make it so that the lower class that does all this labor that allows for a sophisticated society to exist may actually just be robots and artificial intelligence. And I think it's really interesting how the narratives are developing. Most of the narratives are really wealthy people that are afraid of artificial intelligence. And I think it's the reason that they're afraid is that there's this big imagination gap for what they want to use it for. Like the folks that are the richest and most powerful, you can call them power hungry, or you can just say they're fluent in the language of power and money. And to the folks that are fluent in the language of power, they think about machines and robotics, artificial intelligence, that sort of thing. And they ask the question, how can this be used to amass more power? And I think if you ask that question, yes, you should be super scared of what happens if that's the main question you're asking about these new technologies. If instead you ask what I think is a more compelling question, which is, how can you use new technologies for humanity to become a net positive nature? How can you use these new technologies for humanity to become a net positive to humanity? You end up with very different conclusions on what happens because we invest in AI and robotics.
So there's a massive mindset shift that needs to happen when it comes to asking those two questions and shifting from that place of fear and ominous narrative around technology. How do we get to that mindset shift? I know that you work with a lot of top executives and you do coaching and you help people in that realm. What are some of those steps? And before I hear that answer, I also wanted to say that there are those people who are more committed to conserving our biodiversity, but how do you get to that place? Like there's some people who do care about the earth and some people who just don't have that connection to the earth.
Yeah, I mean, I think a natural connection point between the first question and the second is that when you are building any systems, then you've got to ask yourself, ultimately, what do we do it for? And do we do it for, hey, I'm fluent in the language of power and money, so we do it for the purpose of amassing more power and money? Or do we do it for some other goal than that? And relative to answering your specific second question, a lot of times I'll start with leaders and we'll start out with the tactical, like, what are you doing this day, this week, this quarter? And we'll just talk about some of the things. Oh, we got this milestone at the end of the quarter. We got, here's what our operating meetings look like on a Monday at my staff meeting, et cetera, et cetera. But as we start talking, as we dig into that a bit, then I start asking some of the deeper questions where it's like, yeah, but why do you do this? right? Like, why is it so important to hit this next milestone? Oh yeah, because it's going to really, drive more engagement. Okay, well, great. Well, why is that important? And eventually you're going to get down to some of the basics, and people are either going to end up on a really firm foundation where underneath all these different layers, they actually do have something fundamental that they believe in. And sometimes that is in, you know, really wanting to be able to help other people. Other times it might be the environment, it might be any number of things, but there's like a clearly well-grounded pro-social, thing at the core. And then other times you dig into it and it's ungrounded. And people are just like, well, I don't know. I mean, I've just been working this hard for a while. I mean, I'm an immigrant. My parents were immigrants. I was taught to work really hard. I just kind of stuck with it. And of course, I got to hit my milestones. And that's a great opportunity actually, because that is type of a ungrounded motivation where you want to go and explore together in the coaching process of like, well, let's find a way to ground that motivation. You're going to have a lot more traction on creating what you are hoping to create in your lifetime if you're able to go ground why you're in this in the first place. And the grounding oftentimes, and this will sound interesting, but I can go into depth on this if you want. But normally people want to say, oh, well, let's put out an inspiring vision. That's what's going to ground you. But I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, the grounding actually comes from something that is way more intrinsically painful, which is it's almost the answer to the question of, if I were to die and I had not made a difference in this, I would have been fully disappointed in my life. And that is also deeply grounded, right? And there's something about it being motivated by tragedy. And a lot of times those tragedies are related to things that have happened in your life. So you are growing up and your grandma had a stroke when you were young. And that became a thing that you really got passionate about, making sure that nobody unnecessarily dies or experiences severe disability, from a stroke. And that obviously comes from a place of pain, but it's a thing that is deeply grounded and can guide you for an extended period of time. So we do this sort of stuff, and sometimes in the leadership coaching world, we call this establishing the North Star. But I find a lot of North Star activities like to be a little cheesy. It's just like, oh, well, let's paint a picture of the vision board, beautiful future you want to make. And it's like, isn't that exciting? And then I just don't feel the depth in it. Like when people then get into major obstacles, which you're just going to as any leader trying to do anything significant in the world, then if you kind of tossed it out there as like a vision board vision, then you just don't, it doesn't necessarily inspire the same amount of grit within you to see it through. I know that part of the reason that I'm in the environmental work that I'm in right now is I watched my coral reef die. Over the course of a couple months, I saw it go from every color of the rainbow and countless fish to gray and brown and no fish. And it was because of thermal stress due to, global warming. And I was like, well, like if I were to die and not have even tried to do anything about this, I'd be fully disappointed. Like I know that I would have just been denying something that was deeply important to me.
Thank you. So we work with a lot of founders at the early stage in building their biotech companies. And really, we do try to ask them to go on that journey of why. Why are they doing what they're doing? And oftentimes, you mentioned that there are obstacles. How do you go about getting to the core of what those obstacles might be and how to move past them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not only are there obstacles, it's mostly obstacles. So like I think people should also get used to that, which is success is really mostly spending your time on obstacles. And
Mm.
then a little bit of things where you get recognized or you get an award for blah after 4.5 years of doing blah, with a 3-year time delay before anybody noticed that you were involved in it. That's what those are the things I mentioned that because that's the stuff that we hold up, on the mantle as, oh, that's what success looks like. Having all your coworkers applaud you as you accept some award on stage and you get to give this, 5-minute thank you speech. That's what success is. No, success is like 95% dealing with obstacles. So how do you find obstacles? It's mostly obstacles. It's almost like, how do you find water in the ocean? It's mostly water. Now, like, that said, what I was saying before about grit is, in a thing that's mostly obstacles, if you're trying to get all the way through it with just hope, it may not be enough. Like you actually might need to have experienced real tragedy in order to go have the grit to see through obstacles. I don't know. Sometimes somebody's inspiring vision is so strong, but like I said, that's the 1 out of 10 case. How do you go deal with obstacles? One thing that's really fortunate is that a lot of things that have happened in business, they've already happened to other business people over the years, over the centuries. And in terms of, oh, I've never run into an obstacle where, this sort of tax situation comes up. Oh, I never ran into an obstacle where my competitor is trying to go lock out my freedom of operate in this way. Oh, I've never run into an obstacle where my co-founders are fighting at such a level, I think that it's breaking the company apart. But trust me, there's a bunch of business people that have seen every one of those obstacles and more. So like in a way, like overcoming obstacles is kind of no harder than finding some folks that have been through that course before, and it will at least give you interesting inputs to go play around with as you go work on your own obstacle. But I think what is interesting is most of the direct, because I also teach a bunch of tactical techniques to go improve different parts of work. And those techniques are almost like the laws of physics. It's a cause and effect type thing. It's like, you do this, you will get this outcome. You do this, you will get this outcome. There's in a way no magic about it at all. But like when I see it, and I've done it, I've done a bunch of these techniques with at this point thousands of teams, and I see it work. Yeah, like when people actually do the techniques, then I see it work basically 100% of the time. So when I see it not working, then it's typically because people have got an internal blockage around actually just doing the work in that way. And why would you not want to do that work in that way? Some of my techniques involve a lot of user connection and feedback. And it's like, well, I've seen executives hem and haw. It's like, no, it's not really ready for the customer yet. What if they think badly about me, et cetera, et cetera? Those are inner game issues. Those are not outer game issues. And like what my approach to being able to go suss out how to understand myself as a leader and how to go work with other leaders is, well, we start with just the cause and effect techniques. I know they work. So, you have an obstacle, let's use this cause and effect technique to go sort it out. We're working on it, we're making some progress, and then 50% way through, boom, you're just stuck. And you're like, well, why are you stuck? It's like, have you still been doing the things? Like, no, I stopped doing it. It's like, well, how come? And that is the entry point to the inner game questions.
Mm.
And that's where all the interesting stuff comes up. It's like, well, I could do that, but now I'm going to start stepping on the toes of one of my co-founders, and I don't want to do that because, wow, he gets really snappy when that happens. And last time we did that, like we weren't really on great terms for another 3 weeks. Well, there's some inner game stuff to go work on, right? Or, oh, I do this, but like if we put it in front of the customers, then like maybe we're leaving a bad impression. And really what that is an internal sense in you about being seen and judged. And I was like, well, that's awesome, right? Now we're on to the real thing. And then like what I tend to do is I will approach the inner game things not so much as a gotcha, but a little bit more like so I've noticed that, when this kind of thing happens, you just stop or freeze, or you had issues, or you told me 3 weeks ago that, you get to this step and then you're lost. And I was like, well, do you want to explore what might be happening there? And, whatever, 10 times out of 10, people are like, yeah, I mean, that's the thing that's holding us back right now. Let's talk about it. because if you start by saying, oh, there's some inner game thing wrong with you, then people are like, well, let's not talk about this. But if you start from the, hey, you know how, we're still having trouble with this, or, I've noticed that, this thing is not achieving the goals that you had listed yet. Do you want to explore it together? Then yeah, 10 times out of 10, they'll say yes. And then we'll hit that frontier of the inner game, and then we'll start gauging how ready are they to move on the inner game frontier as well as the outer game frontier.
Wow. So I really like the distinction you make about how many of our um, problems or challenges, at least in business, you can find resources to help you because many people have been through them before, and that when you reach a wall, it's then becomes an inner game issue or inner game challenge to approach, and that's where I think the real leadership emerges in finding your own power and understanding how you can move past certain challenges. Um, Thank you, Tom. I think the work that you're doing is really important. Right now, we are at a time when many of us um, can be doing the inner game work, and so how do we inspire that? How do we ask that of each other, particularly in business and in places like, for example, where I work at a venture capital fund? It is important because we are doing really big work together.
Yeah. So what I'll say about inner game work is that there's like a readiness element of it, and there is a awareness element of it, and then there's a practical skills element of it. Sometimes it's, people are aware they have these inner game hurdles to get over, and other times it's completely invisible to them. And it's just kind of like, hey, back channeling, the team is a little concerned that you lose your temper in these situations. And they haven't brought it up with you because you lose your temper. Duh, right? So you're not totally aware of it. You just think you're a strong leader and you're really putting, like getting people into action and really laying down the law, and you're not really hearing what the inner game issue is. Now, if we can raise in your awareness what it is, then sometimes there will be the willingness and readiness, and sometimes there won't. And that's why I'm saying like all these things need to be in place. If the willingness and readiness is there, now we talk about the skills development. But I will typically try to chase it down that chain. If you imagine like the work that you're doing in your own team, and some of the things that you have seen, and this is not even so much like, oh, there's all these gotchas, and I'm going to call out my coworker for being the angry one, and this other, one for being the one that's afraid of confrontation, and this other one for, you know, uh, always being annoyed that people are quote unquote stepping on their toes and blah blah blah. Like that's not what this type of work is for. That might be the symptom that you notice that says to yourself, oh, we should look at this. But like the thing that you are, the kind of attitude that you're coming at this with is, look, I have a finite life, and I get to work with the people around me for a finite period of time, and I want to be able to go express the most, be the most effective, be the best colleague, and be most productive in this setting as possible. And I want to help others do the same thing. And you might notice it because it's like, look at how angry this person is, or look at how this person shuts out every other engineer that they think is less capable than them, and that's creating this kind of combative situation. Or look at how there's elites in the company and there's other folks that are not considered important for decision making, da da da. But that is less to call it out, but it's a little bit more of a, okay, let's bring it to awareness, and let's talk about whether there's any willingness or readiness to do something about this. If so, let's dig into it. If you're in a work setting where you notice these things and you bring up the awareness a bunch of times and there's no willing or readiness, if you are not a senior leader in that organization, you might want to leave. If you are a senior leader in that organization, well, you have to understand that a bunch of what's happening in the culture is also related to what you're doing. So you start with changing some of those things in yourself, and then you start and after you've been working on that for a couple weeks, then you might reach out to some close colleagues and say, hey, here's what I've been doing, and this is why I'm trying to do it. And first off, I want to see if you like noticed any of these changes, and if it's working at all, and get some feedback on how it's going. And also, if this is interesting work, then and you'd be interested in doing it with me, then I would love to do this with you, right? And now it's spreading to some of, more executive leaders beyond yourself. But what doesn't work is to not be doing the work yourself and then trying to call everybody else on the work. Where you say, well, I'm the good executive here, you're the angry one, and you're the weepy one. Like, you guys need to fix yourselves up, like step it up. Like that, I'm just going to say it doesn't go over well.
Yeah, lead by example. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and zoom out. You have currently started a new fund. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what your focus is?
Yeah, I started a new fund and a firm that is going to go and have a bunch of funds. But the name of the firm is At One Ventures, and it's about helping us become at one with ourselves, with nature, and the universe more broadly. And it's just a compressed way of going after the goal of having humanity become a net positive to nature.
Mm, I love that core value. And so, what's your first focus at One Ventures? Where are you looking at?
Well, our thesis is that we want to invest in disruptive deep tech, which changes both the unit economics and environmental economics of the industries that we participate in. And the reason to have those criteria is there's a lot of folks that like want to make a positive impact, but their business really boils down to a template that sounds something like, hey, if you're willing to pay 50% more for this t-shirt, yoga pant, whatever, food delivery service, if you're willing to go pay 50% more, we've made something that's 30% better for the environment. And I'm just going to say that those sorts of businesses absolutely can become successful businesses, but they very rarely rewrite the way an industry works.
Mm,
Right? In order to rewrite the way an industry works, you need to beat the fundamental unit economics of that industry. But if you only beat the unit economics and just make it so that more money comes out, you get better margins, let's say, then you may not have done anything positive for the ecosystem. In fact, you might have gotten there by cutting even more corners. So we typically are looking for the things that are massively changing the unit economics and also changing the environmental economics in a massive and positive way.
cool. I like that message for anybody out there who's listening right now and considering about getting into a space of investing. One thing we're doing at the Genesis Consortium is to engage people in the more important conversations. What would you say today is the most important problem we need to be solving
Well, that's
together?
yeah, okay, as a consortium.
Yes.
Okay. Man, there's a lot going on in the venture world. I mean, if I had a magic wand, then we would change a number of things about how venture is structured and incentivized. And we would also change a number of things about the sort of like how capital flows in the ecosystem in order to allow, new exciting things to happen. And just to concretize that a bit, it used to be that governments would spend a lot of money on fundamental research. And then folks that were part of that fundamental research might be inspired to go start a company. And then, but like by the time the stuff is spinning out, then you have maybe a decade even of government research behind you, which has made really significant science engineering strides in an area. And that stuff wouldn't be venture backed. Now we live in a world where we have privatized so much of everything, and government budgets for foundational science and engineering research has gotten a lot weaker. Some of it happens through universities, though even those are oftentimes corporate sponsored. It's like, here's the Intel sponsorship for a semiconductor physics at Cornell, and you're like, okay, cool. I guess it's real clear who paid for that. Because I mean, like it's in your job title when you're doing that fellowship. Um, and you look at that and it's like, oh, this is contracting things quite a bit. Like the sorts of, the diversity of early stage bets is contracted by the lack of access to this kind of grant non-dilutive capital that kind of allows us to get over some of the fundamental science and engineering work. And what it has led to is what I think to be kind of this weird, it's not fully degenerate, but it's certainly not optimal state around venture capital, where there's all these funds that focus on purely software businesses because that's where you get your multiples, right? And and in addition to that, like everything needs to be recurring revenue, and then everything like falls into this incredibly I don't know, cookie cutter kind of template, because that's what folks have found is able to go move some numbers sooner, and then you can raise your next fund and boost your assets under management, and this whole kind of incentive chain that happens. And I look at this, I look at some of the companies today that have raised billions of dollars, and you look back at Google, Google only ever raised $200 million. And a bunch of other, companies that had been successful stalwarts of, the modern era of technology raised significantly less than startups that are doing comparatively little. That's the nice way to say it. And it's like, well, that is a major mismatch in the way that we are thinking about capital allocation. Like we either got way worse at it, or there was a marketplace imbalance where there's a huge number of people that saw some people getting rich in venture, and then a bunch of capital flooded in. And then there was a local game around boosting assets under management that the fund managers were willing to play along with. And everybody lost sight of, why do we even do this work? Mm-hmm. And this is why, like, down to the name of our fund and the name of our firm, it's like, no, this is what we're here for. And we recently just rejected some deals where it's like, that's probably a great business, and you're going to have no significant impact on the world we're passing.
So how specifically does it need to change when it comes to, is it to engage more people, make it more inclusive? What are the things that need to change in venture?
Whew. Definitely to go make it more inclusive. There was a paper that spoke about bias in investment decisions, and they were tracking something like, they did an analysis of something like $60 trillion worth of assets under management. So kind of a lot, like it's all of it globally that isn't like held by governments. Yeah. And they found out that 98.7% of those assets are managed and controlled by white men. And then they went and did the study in terms of how that affects investment decisions, and it's easily measurable. It's not one of those things where it's like, oh, it's kind of hidden in the noise, and we really need to do this deep, deep data dive in order to go isolate out the part that is statistically significant. Nope, it's right there. And when you say, okay, so 98.7% to white men, so that means 1.3% to everybody else, all people of color, all women. That's like the great majority of the world, actually, is the folks that are getting to make the decisions with the 1.3%. That's ridiculous. Like, we're obviously not making the right decisions.
So moving into the future, we're in the coronavirus right now. What are your thoughts on that? So
yeah.
call for us is, are we at a big transition point?
I think it's going to take a really long time for us to get on the other side of this, and that our definition of normal is going to be different afterwards than before. And, at some point we're going to go define whatever that is as normal, and we'll be fine again. Like, the best thing and worst thing about humans is we can habituate to a very wide range of situations. Mm-hmm. So the world gets worse and people are like, this is pretty good. And like and actually looping back to the environmental thing for a moment, like I got a chance to have dinner with Charles Baran, who like was the person who, he is originally from Australia. Like he documented all the corals. And we were talking about some of the places we had mutually seen the corals in. Now I'm younger than him by like 35 years or something, right? There's at least a generation gap between us. And the places that I went to that I was like, oh, that still looks pretty healthy. That looks pretty good. Like he was tearing up a little bit because he knows what the baseline used to be. And for me, that's like the new normal of like, oh, well, that's a pretty healthy reef now. I was in the Coral Triangle, off the coast of Sulawesi Island, and here's this great thing I saw. And Charles Varane was like, oh, I mean, you should have really seen it. So this is kind of the stuff that we need to be looking out for in terms of what we will habituate to, after this, whatever, when we get to the other side of a pandemic. Because there's some changes and where it's like, hey, are we going to let contact tracing become a new way that we track our entire population? Is that a thing that we should, allow ourselves to habituate to? Is it a thing that we should just plan to be a touchless society? Like, is that a thing that we should habituate to? And I think this is the time period to be asking some of those harder questions. Now, it's absolutely the time frame as well where a lot can be changed in a short amount of time. I mean, one of the main criticisms of the Green New Deal, and I work in these sectors in more detail than these policies in the Green New Deal, have touched. Like, I'm just going to say that that is like a rough outline right now that's trying to become a plan or a policy. But like one of the main objections to it was that, oh, you're asking for $1 trillion over 10 years. That's crazy. Like that could never happen. And then, we like pandemic strikes and we spin off $2.2 trillion in the span of like a couple weeks of deliberation. And I was like, well, that meant we always could have done it. It meant that we always could have done it if we actually wanted to. We could make $1 trillion decision in a month. And actually, that's already spent. That's not even, let's do $2.2 trillion over the course of 10 years. That's like, we spent a $2.2 trillion in a quarter. And those are decisions we've always been capable of making, but we have never actually just put together the energy to get it over the line. And I think this is the time period to ask some of the questions around that too. Like, what are the decisions that we can make in this time period, get them over the line, that can be strongly positively impactful for the future of society and nature?
I like that, asking the right questions, because we have solutions. There are solutions and there is capital. It's a matter of agreeing on where they should be allocated and what we should be focusing on. And so hopefully as we continue having these conversations, they become a global conversation that people can agree upon what needs to happen and together.
And we're capable of amazing things when we actually spend time on it. Like if you think about the cell phone industry, and well, let's not even take the whole thing. Let's just take the glass in the screens. That you can now drop some glass from 2 meters up or hit it with a hammer, and it doesn't, scratch or crack the screen now. And you're like, wow. I mean, when we actually decide to try, like, look what you can do with a little bit of sand and some rare earth metals, like when you actually decide to try. So I think around all the things, around all these parts of the economy that we have abandoned, around farming, around manufacturing, around all these sorts of things, we're like, those are old school jobs for people with rough hands that are going to work 12 hours a day and with poorly trained, and we should just go to the cheapest labor market. That's us deciding that a thing's going to be crappy. So imagine like when cell phones first started coming out, they're like, you know what? Let's actually not make this too good. Let's just kind of leave it, at the level that it was when it was like a 30-pound suitcase that you need to lug around, and there was no service, and like the buttons were hard to press, and we'll just leave it like that. I mean, that's what we're like in a bunch of these industries. And in the handful of industries where we really decided to try, we went real far, in a decade. So we're capable of that on almost anything, and we just have not mustered the focus.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's a really great place to close because it sounds like there is an awesome opportunity as we look forward in the future of making better decisions and not accepting the status quo either, but really creating a better future.
Yeah, I gave a talk at a conference once, and I was talking about the future of regenerative agriculture. And during the Q&A, somebody raised their hands and they're like, I get what you're saying, and a bunch of these things are really inspiring, and I'd never heard of that project before. I'm going to look that up. But like, I just wanted to ask the question. I mean, it's like, you've got Monsanto, you got Cargill, you got all these big moneyed players, that are behind unsustainable, monocrop, high input agriculture. Like, how could we ever change? How could we ever move off of this way of growing? And it's like, I as much as I love, new approaches to regenerative agriculture, I just don't understand how we can move off of unsustainable agriculture. And my response was instant. It was just, we just invented unsustainable agriculture like 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we just made it. Like, whatever. If you talk about the very earliest experiments of Norman Borlaug, then maybe we're talking about 50, 55 years ago, but it wasn't widely practiced yet. So it's like you look at something like that and it's like, well, we literally just made it. How could you ever imagine that that's permanent when we literally just made it? Like, if you ask your grandparents, they remember the time before it existed. And if you ask your grandkids, they will remember the time after it existed. And you just got to put it in that perspective. In your lifetime, yeah, maybe it'll be a particular way for, a sizable chunk of your lifetime. And also, that's no reason that it's not going to change by the time your kids or grandkids experience it.
That's true. And, it is, for me at least, uplifting to know that you look at these big corporations, you just think of them as corporations without actual people behind them. But the people behind them are growing and learning. They are people who have the ability to change their mindsets, and they are curious, and they are learning new ways to, say, change the unsustainable practices that they've gotten into. And so that's something that at least gives me hope. And if we can engage those people more, that would be cool.
Well, I mean, from the perspective of leadership, yeah, it's true. A lot of these companies have fantastic people inside of them. Even the worst companies you've ever heard of that we go and throw. Like, I'm actually on the science and technology board of a startup with somebody who was the former head of science at Monsanto. And it's like, oh, you're actually a brilliant, kind person. And also, you were in a structure where like your work was mostly used to go promote a particular model of agriculture and expansion. And when we took you out of that setting and we could just get you back to your scientific core and start working on things that are healthier for the planet, you were as valuable, if not more. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with you. And from the leadership perspective, we should all strive to, develop this sort of organizations which allows the better nature of our people to go and dominate the conversation. Well, the reason that we are so down on big corporations, at this particular juncture in history, is we have made it so that the de facto approach that we do things in big corporations does not bring out the better nature of people. It brings out something between neutral to slightly negative, where it's like, well, I'm usually a pretty chill person, but I'm going to be really suspicious about you in this context because it's a business transaction. Or neutral, where it's like, oh, we're doing these transactions, you're my supplier, I supply downstream to this person, we're all doing our job, it's all transactional. But none of these things are really calling forward the better nature, the creativity, the all the stuff that is really powerful in a human. It's not really calling it forward. So part of leadership as a skill too is to make sure that you do not structurally encode things that bring out the worst in people or lesser in people. And to the extent that you are finding things that start to bring out the best in people, then those are the things that you want to structurally encode. And that sounds so dumb and easy, and also it's almost never done.
Mm-hmm.
And when it does get done, it gets on the cover of Fortune magazine, where it's like, hey, come and visit the Google offices. And then it's like, yeah, because they just did some stuff. They're like, hey, so these yoga classes are useful to people. You know,
Yeah.
having a smoothie bar is useful for people. And it's like, okay. And look, a bunch of the work practices too. I'm outside of the amenities. It's like a bunch of the work practices also just bring out the best in people. Like Google went and did this whole leadership survey, and they said one of the strongest indicators of a healthy team is that uh, the entire team gets a voice. And I was like, oh, it's such a simple thing. But to the extent that you are a leader that is making sure that everybody in your team gets a voice, then and you hear out even the really junior folks and try to do something useful with their inputs, it's like that's the sort of structural thing that you can strive for that will bring out the best in people.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like every once in a while a company does that and it gets on the cover of a magazine. That's how rare this stuff is right now. So like in a way, in this juncture, in the beginning of the 21st century, it's kind of easy to be a good leader because we've been so bad. And so I don't know if you want to count that as hopeful or depressing, but like, yeah, you could be on the cover of whatever you want, in 5 years if you actually decide to go stick with something that's a little bit more pro-social and brings out the best in people.
Well, I think we certainly need to raise the bar on leadership, certainly here in America. And so I just want to say thank you for this incredible conversation. And also thank you for dedicating your life to unleashing real human potential. And so, so I look forward to seeing you around, Tom, and talking to you more in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maya.